I'm going to speak for Gavin as well as myself, that we are two of the founding members of SAL. So it's always a pleasure to be a part of this group and the ongoing amazing work that this group is doing. So we want to talk to you today about the impact of a sense of belonging in college. And I'm Erin Bentrim, Senior Education and Training Specialist in Global Education Services at Anthology, Inc. I work in the assessment space with Anthology Academy, as well as individual campuses on assessment. So I came to Anthology in 2021 after about 25 years on campuses, with the last 16 being directing IE and student affairs assessment offices. So thank you for having us.
So I'm Gavin Henning, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm professor of higher education at New England College in New Hampshire, where I direct our Master of Science in Higher Education Administration, as well as our Doctor of Education programs. And I work with both student affairs assessment and academic affairs assessment on my campus. So I'll pass it back to Erin. Oh, you're muted, Erin.
Of course, I'll get to be the first one to do it. Okay, so where I would like to start is give a little bit of environmental context around why we decided to write this book. And I am going to go off camera right now so you can look at the slideshow only. Okay, so what I'd like to do is think about a few data points related to birth rates in the United States, college enrollment trends, retention, persistence, and graduation rates. So Pew Research, there are some key facts about US fertility trends before COVID-19 actually even hit us. Birth rates were already at a record low before the pandemic. And some of this was because of the effects of the Great Recession. Teen birth rates had significantly dropped. Increase in educational attainment and delays in marriage were all reasons that some of the fertility trends were trending downward. So rather than the anticipated baby boom arising from the pandemic, the professional data shows that birth rates actually dropped 4% from 2019 to 2020. So let's consider some data from the NCES. 2003 to 2017, which is undergraduate enrollment increased by 17%. When you look at 2017 to predicted to 2018, undergraduate enrollment projections show an increase of only 2%. And those were pre-pandemic projections. When we look at retention graduation rates, 30% of students drop out before their sophomore year, and only 62% graduate within 6 years. So a little bit about the COVID impact. In 2020, it was felt primarily in community colleges. And in fall 2020, about 5 of every 6 students who did not show up for college would have been attending community colleges. Enrollments at 4-year schools held up pretty well. But this changed in fall of 2021. So even as vaccines enabled campuses to reopen and pandemic fears were receding, enrollment still continued to drop. They were much more broadly based. Half of them came from 4-year colleges and universities where there were fewer freshmen, lower retention and persistence rates. And recent data as of September 2022 showed that higher ed lost 1.3 million students. So with the baby bust looming and the enrollment cliff arriving earlier than anticipated, colleges and universities, as we've seen, have started grappling with the idea and the reality that historical approaches to maintain and increasing student retention, persistence, and graduation rates are increasingly ineffectual. So that's just a little bit, if you think about, those numbers are already a little bit scary. And as conversations shifted to uncovering barriers to student success, While at the same time, there is an ongoing recognition that student success is more than academic factors alone and more than engagement and involvement alone. Gavin and I both observed on our own campuses that we were hearing the term student sense of belonging, and it seemed to have gained some traction in both academic and co-curricular settings. Now, what we noticed in these conversations was the lack of a consistent definition, the lack of an overarching theoretical approach, and there was also a struggle to try and connect disparate research. So while there is sound research out there, it's all across the literature. There's, not a lot of agreement, as I said, and a compendium of research applications and approaches to sense of belonging didn't exist. So our intention was to bring together the research into one volume and address what sense of belonging is, what it looks like, and how it impacts student success. In fall 2019, we extensively researched belonging and determined that this book would be a worthwhile publication. We put out the call for authors in April 2020, which was about 1 month after the pandemic started. So we were a little unsure of what that would mean for this book. And I am delighted to say that this conversation has become even more valuable for educators as a result of the pandemic and the shift in new teaching modalities and what dealing with closed down campuses. And students are changing. The students that we have are changing. So let's talk a little bit about definitions. Terrell Strayhorn was one of the first people to recognize that sense of belonging is really the key to educational success. So in 2012, Dr. Strayhorn published one of the first books that discussed and described the concept. In his 2012 text and in chapter 2 of the current text, he explains the differences between engagement, involvement, and belonging. And that's generally the first question we get. What is the difference between these things? How is belonging different? So they're correlates, but they're not synonyms. So I think Dr. Strayhorn sums it up in a nice way for us to think about and remember. Engagement refers to what students do. That means that's a student's college-related activities and experiences. Involvement is the commitment to what they do. So it's the investment in time and energy in engaging activities. Now, with those two things, belonging is the outcome. In other words, students get that feeling of I matter. So sense of belonging is an outcome of the activities and the involvement, which is the investment, and a feeling of I matter. Go to the next slide, Gavin. Now, I know this is a lot of text for a slide, but I really like this quote as it's a wonderful summary of Dr. Strayhorn's definitions. And I won't read it to you, but I like having it in the recording and in the PowerPoint for everyone to refer back to. So this is really, and again, he goes into about engaged colleges, which is important as we talk about the shift of how our universities approach our students. So I like this quote a lot. Okay, so what we will talk about next is the major sections of the book. So we tried to break it out into 3 different parts: theories and foundations, sense of belonging across student populations, and then implications and applications. So we'll approach the rest of our conversation in this order, and we will also have towards the end, how can we apply this with student affairs assessment? What are some ways it can impact the work that we do in assessment? So theoretical foundations. By clearly articulating the theoretical evaluation of the term sense of belonging for higher ed, Vaccaro and Newman, which is chapter 1 in this book, provide a clear explanation of what it is and what it is not. Sorry, Gavin, I'm making sure we're on the same slide. We are. Okay. So let's think about this. Belonging is a developmental process that's rooted in the basic human need to be safe, respected, and to comfortably fit in as our authentic selves. So as students move into and through college, they develop that sense of belonging as they navigate welcoming, unwelcoming campus environments, as they engage in curricular and extracurricular activities, and also as they develop relationships with peers and faculty. So as they move into and through college, they are mastering the student role. Note that belonging should not be relegated to just student affairs or just academic affairs. It is about the institution creating a welcome environment at all levels. So we need to think about, we always talk about college-ready students, but what about student-ready colleges? And I think that's where the conversation needs to begin to shift. So belonging is inherently tied to our social identities and the nuanced forms of oppression experienced and resisted by students from different social identity groups. Now, since there's a nuance to this, the strategies to foster belonging must be as nuanced as well. So both systems of oppression embedded in the environment and biases enacted via relationships by member of the campus community must be address all of these intersectionalities of different social identities. Now, although many students report fostering a sense of belonging via involvement in organizations where they could be their authentic selves, institutions should not and must not solely rely on student involvement to foster belonging. I think we tend to say, okay, if you get involved, you're going to be retained, you're going to be successful, you're going to persist. But instead, we need to move away from that and think about taking a comprehensive and holistic approach to fostering belonging for our diverse college student populations. So like I said, we need to get rid of that bias in the direction of welcoming college-ready students and transform into an ecosystem of student-ready colleges. And sense of belonging is the opposite of a college-ready environment. Institutions should no longer, as they develop and grow and foster an environment for sense of belonging, you can no longer address student success from a deficit model. The responsibility for creating that environment is on the institution and not solely up to the student. Okay, so now that we have an idea of what sense of belonging means and that it's tied to our identities, let's talk a little bit about what it looks like for different student populations. Thank you. So I think an easy way to approach this is thinking about sense of belonging as an input, environment, output model. This is the model that Ellison and Braxton proposed in chapter 3. So let's approach our next few minutes looking at it this way. So the model inputs would be student characteristics. Good grief, you'd think I could speak today. So socioeconomic status, first generation status, racial and ethnic minority background. So those are all inputs that students bring with them. The environment are the campus and climate experiences. So this is regarding peers, faculty, co-curricular engagement, campus climate. Those are all the environments. The output part of this model is a positive outcome of a strong sense of belonging for college students, which will then include academic achievement, and retention. So these particular outputs are especially true for students from underrepresented populations. So if we have that input and we have that positive environment, we are more likely to have positive academic achievement and student success. Correspondingly, a lack of belonging in higher education correlates with a variety of negative outcomes. So if we're missing that positive outcome of strong sense of belonging, lack of belonging also impedes academic performance and influences students' decisions to stay enrolled in college. So let's look at a little bit of, now that we understand belonging as a construct, as a model, and that's related to our social identities, let's look at research on a couple of specific populations. These are all chapters from the book, and we've had some amazing authors, so I have to say that they have done the hard work on this, and I feel grateful to be able to share their work. So just a couple of thoughts on social identity and sense of belonging. Low socioeconomic and economic stratification. Now, if we know that being engaged and involved fosters belonging, this involvement can be hindered by lack of money to participate, or time to get involved could be limited by the need to work or care for children. So if you see how that can make sense as to what that hindrance or that barrier might be, and part of our responsibility would be to help this particular student population have these opportunities. When we talk about commuting students, this is also if you're commuting. You also don't have the same amount of time to become involved. Again, maybe you're caring for parents, maybe you're working. So these are all aspects that can impact whether or not sense of belonging is developed. When we think about racial and ethnic minorities, these students are susceptible to lower levels of belonging as compared to their white peers. And this is especially true at PWI, or predominantly white institutions. Much of the, and I think that goes back to being an authentic self, having people who look like you, who you can cultivate positive campus environments, peer faculty that look like you. So that's another piece of that transition of helping to create a sense of belonging. Now, one thing that's interesting, there's been a lot of talk about decolonizing methodology and decolonizing our syllabus. And so I want to include a little bit in here about Native American and Indigenous American students, and how there's so many things on campus that can cause them to have a negative feeling or negative campus experience. So much of the dissonance that Native students have experienced is the result of colonization, which includes government-sanctioned removal from land and extermination, which has led to the erasure of Native culture and identity. So forced assimilations thrust Eurocentric ideas, such as valuing individual over community upon Native students. I mean, anything if you think about in a history class, a student commented, we had to talk about Columbus Day, and there was no other, differing viewpoint, no other acceptance or discussion of the history of what Columbus Day might mean to me and to my other peers. So the combination of those relationships that Native students, let me back up. So since Eurocentric ideas value the individual over community, this is not something that Native students may feel comfortable with, and it hinders their development of sense of belonging. Their combination of relationships is belonging based on people and belonging based on space, which creates that unique psychosocial research and environment. And Albanza discusses more about this in his chapter. The other thing is, other research has shown that targeted interventions to normalize collegiate hardships serves to increase belonging and academic outcomes for minority students. The last group I want to touch upon is LGBTQ plus students. When these voices have been included in conversations on campuses about belonging, students discussed elements of belonging that are absent in the definitions in other minoritized populations. These students experienced belonging when they felt safe, and part of this is physically safe. And this group is one of the few populations that included that in their definition. They felt like they belong when they feel physically and emotionally safe, and when they had the ability to be themselves and have their salient identities validated by others. So those are just a few pieces of how to, and we'll get into some application, but this is some of the research behind different minoritized student populations and things that we need to address and look at, and of which we need to be aware. And Gavin, I think I'll let you go from here.
Sure. So as Erin mentioned, student identity was really prominent in the call for chapter. So we actually didn't really put together, we know we wanted those main sections, but we really did the call for chapters so we could find out what was out there. And a lot of the submissions were around student identity and the overlap of that and the impact of that. And I posted a link to the table of contents so you can see the various student identities that are written about in the book. Some are more, I would call, involvement types of identities. So people, first year experience programs, so veteran students, student employees. So it's not necessarily all racial or ethnic identities or sexual identities. But there are a couple of chapters around the intersection of identities, which really plays a big part of that, as well as the intersection between gender and race. So it's really evident to us that sense of identity was a really big issue. And that the identity and the salience of the identities at different points in time had an impact. For example, even going back to Sterel Trehorn's work on some of his research, he talked to a gay Black student who didn't feel like he belonged in the LGBTQ organization on campus. So he found his sense of belonging off campus. So we need to keep in mind not only these individual social identities, but the intersection of all those as well. And then as an institution, we need to be thinking about how do we foster a sense of belonging through identity conscious ways. And there's some great examples in the book from applications that we'll be able to talk a little bit about that and identify and describe how different institutions are doing that. So for some bigger takeaways from the chapters, particularly around what does the theory look like, as well as what does it look like for different students with different identities, we really need to think about how do we focus on assets and how student identities are assets, and how do we really personalize programs and services to students' identities, and keeping that in mind. So are there ways we can actually implement a program? Keep in mind student identities. Are there specific programs that we'll create for students from specific identities that can foster a sense of belonging? A couple examples of those are in the book as well. And then keeping in mind that students are moving through, they're transitioning, both in terms of their identity development, but also keeping in mind not all of our students are traditional age. So there's a great chapter on student veterans and the impact on sense of belonging for them. Commuter students who are traditionally maybe not the traditional age college students, and really thinking about how do we make them feel like they matter, like they belong to something, and what are the ways we can do that. And I think there are certainly programs and services we can create to achieve that goal, but it's also just the individual relationships that we have with folks. So what are some applications for assessment? So this is an assessment structure conversation. So what are the applications? The first is that there are a lot of tools that can be used to measure a sense of belonging. So this is actually one of the big reasons that brought me to this book. I have a doctoral student, Bentrim Henning from the University of Connecticut, is looking at sense of belonging in a mentoring program. And she did a lot of research. I'm having trouble finding a good way to measure this. And so we actually invited a chapter around the different tools. So there's a great chapter that takes a look at all the different tools, gives a little background on each psychometric property. So it's a really good overview of that. But here are 4 of those. And when I think about the role of assessment in student affairs, I go back to some of the work by Bert Ellison and John Braxton around retention. So we look at any of the retention theories, social integration is a huge part of that. And John and Bert really talk about how the connection of sense of belonging is both a moderating factor in terms of retention and persistence, but also an outcome. And so we're really going to demonstrate the impact that student affairs has on retention. Here's a great way to do that, is really demonstrate the impact that out of the classroom experience has on sense of belonging. So great chapter on all those. And the other thing is taking a look at the applications for different functional areas. There's some great examples in the book, but also thinking about what does sense of belonging look like in the residence hall? How can academic advising, particularly professional academic advising model, how might that foster sense of belonging? Or how might it even be tweaked a little bit to focus on sense of belonging? What is campus recreation? What is the impact on that, particularly maybe intramural sports or club sports? How might that foster sense of belonging? How can we use some of those tools to measure that? And then also career development. What does sense of belonging look like in career development? What's the connection between sense of belonging in college and also connection or affinity for a career? The connection through a major through all those. So there are a lot of applications for this work for sense of belonging and assessment within these. But before we go on to future research and final thoughts, we have a couple of authors that are luckily on this call. So I've asked them privately via the chat if they'd be willing to share a little bit about their chapter, and they both agreed to. So I'm very excited. So first, I'm going to ask Sydney Cogswell to talk a little bit about her chapter. So I'll ask her first to do a quick introduction and then share a quick overview of her chapter. Cindy? Oh, Cindy, you're muted. She's looking for, there we go.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Cindy Cogswell. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to be one of the chapters in this text. I co-wrote, I think it's number 19, a chapter with 2 of my colleagues from Ohio University, Tim Epley and Brittany Barton, and I currently work for New York University as a data strategist. What we wrote about in our chapter was an effort to understand student-employee sense of belonging, recognizing that student employees were a group that we had a lot of time with in our Division of Student Affairs. And I would suspect that a lot of the folks on this call who work in student affairs have a similar population. And you can see it in the book. It feels like a commercial. But what we did was we went to the students because we had the largest number of student employees of anyone on campus and maybe anyone combined on campus, especially before COVID. And we asked them what fostered belonging for them. And then we asked some open-ended questions where we said, what in these products, or sorry, I said the chat, what in these experiences had the most impact? And then we wrap it up with some recommendations that practitioners can take with them.
Great. Thanks so much, Cindy. And one of the application chapters was co-written by Alyssa Tubner. So I'm going to ask Alyssa to share a little bit of an overview of her chapter.
Hi, friends. It's wonderful to be able to see you and chat with you all today. I also co-wrote with 2 of my colleagues, part of chapter 19. I got to write with Dr. Laura Dahl and Darissa Collymore, and we're all at North Dakota State University here in Fargo, North Dakota. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and excited to share just a little bit. Our chapter really came out of a literature review that we did as a part of Welcome Week and new student onboarding. What were we missing? What needed to be incorporated so that we were doing more than just having events for students. And what really came out of that was seeing the sense of belonging in the research that you both are talking about today. And we put together a cross-divisional committee to really look at how can we implement belonging into that Welcome Week program, into that part of our functional area. So brought together that committee and created a large group required session and a small group required session, and then some affinity building sessions as well, and used a lot of Brene Brown's work on fitting in versus belonging, and then really focused on student stewardship that they have to create campuses and environments where the belonging is the outcome versus just feeling like they belong. What responsibility do they have to their peers to create that kind of culture on campus, and have some recommendations and some prompts for thinking about how to do that at your own institution.
Great, thanks so much, Alyssa. So before we move to Q&A, let's provide some future research and final thoughts. So really, I think even though there's some tools, they're not necessarily made for higher education. Some are, some aren't. So really focusing on how can we measure a sense of belonging, and then begin to disaggregate that by student identity, since student identity is such a huge factor in this. Looking at the research around educational psychology, figure out what elements of those can we apply and build into the work that we're doing. And also pulling on cognitive neuroscience research. What is the connection between that and sense of belonging? Because there's some emerging work around that. And then also the online and virtual environments. We do have an application chapter on that, but really as student affairs is moving towards these virtual options or hybrid options that really were precipitated by COVID, but we're realizing, they provide some flexible opportunities for connecting students. How can we foster student learning through these online or virtual environments, either through classrooms or more student affairs work that's going on in there? In terms of some of the final thoughts, our higher ed institutions, we really need to play an active role in this, and really thinking about student success as not just GPA, not necessarily just persistence and retention, but also the sense of belonging, because there's so many more benefits to sense of belonging. And moving away from a deficit model, we certainly need to understand differences and where institutions are falling short, but really making sure that we're not putting that falling short as a student issue. That's an institutional issue. And thinking about how do we develop policies, practices, programs, and services that foster sense of belonging, but also looking at them and using assessment, particularly from an equity-centered perspective, to understand how those experiences, those policies and those practices, programs, and services may be limiting or hindering belonging, because that may impact student success. And then keeping in mind that colleges and universities don't exist in a bubble. So, we certainly learned that from COVID, and how COVID had different impacts in different parts of the institution for different parts of the, for different types of institutions. I'm at a small tuition-driven institution, and we really didn't have the resources to quickly go virtually or even hybrid and do that effectively. And so thinking about what are those other elements that can impact how an institution or a department with the student affairs can impact sense of belonging. And then finally, keeping in mind this focus that identity is really at the heart of this. Sense of belonging is different for students who hold different identities. Impacting sense of belonging is different depending on student identities. There is different elements of students' identities are salient at different points in time and can have an impact on all of that. And so those were kind of the key things that we took away from. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite questions from folks. I think there might be one in the chat already, but then please feel free to raise your hand or drop a question in the chat, and we'll go from there. So we have one question. I'm not sure this question can be answered, but what if there are programs that aim to increase sense of belonging, but then other student experiences decrease their sense of belonging? Like, could there be a counteractive situation? Erin, do you have thoughts?
That's a great question. I think part of what the research shows, the existing research, is that there is a continuum of belonging. And I think this is getting to your question, but I think also I might throw that into another future research. But students may only feel a minimal sense of belonging to any one program or service. So faculty and staff need to help students find multiple places, multiple spaces on campus where they can experience that. So my hope would be is that finding those spaces here and there would help counteract the question that you ask, decreasing sense of belonging. Gavin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that totally can happen. I think students feel like they're safe places on campus. If it's a student organization, or when I've talked with students, when they hang out at the Multicultural Student Center, they feel safe. They can be themselves. They can take off their mask, is some language that students have used. But they can be in a classroom and there can be microaggressions all over the place. And so I think there can be these counteractive pieces. So we need to keep in mind, trying to identify what those are. So I think it's a great question because it raises the issue of how complex this is, and simply providing programs and services isn't necessarily going to do the job. And so we need to keep that all in mind. The next question was about a student-ready campus. And I think we don't get into that a lot. So I'm going to drop a link to the book in the chat for student-ready campus, student-ready college, which I think is a great example. They're already on the second edition, which just came out in August. But Erin, is there anything you want to add about creating a student-ready campus?
I think the idea is we put the onus on, let's say, I'm going to use commuting students, for example. Institutions have historically put the onus, if making the student responsible for becoming part of the campus community. We approach it from a deficit model where we say, okay, we've told you about all these things, and if you don't become involved, which, as we know, research shows it impacts student success, retention, academic success, then that's on you. We've given you these tools. Why haven't you used them? And that is really that's not the approach that we want to take. The institution needs to do away with the term of at risk, or, that's the big thing. It's more of a deficit model that we really don't want to use anymore. And I guess the shift is the institution needs to take responsibility. Even with academic advising, well, we said you had to meet with your advisor. What are we doing to make sure that we get to those students and that they get to us? Does that answer that somewhat?
Yeah, and I think the other thing, I like we have to shift our focus to the institutional aspect of it. Estella Ben-Simone and Yolanda Watson-Spiva had a great article in Diverse Issues in Higher Education, which I'll drop into the link. And what they talked about is this idea we need to move away from equity gaps, because that really focuses on the students. While we need to be student focused, it's really a deficit approach. And they argue for the term of institutional performance gaps, which shifts the onus to the institution to address those gaps. So we need to do the disaggregation of data to understand what the differences are, but we also need to think about what does the institution do? How do we address these issues? And so I think really the bottom line about being a student-ready campus is how do we focus on what the institution should be doing to help students succeed? If we accept students into our institution, we have a responsibility to help them succeed.
And may I add one other thing to that, Gavin? Since we talked about that different subgroups have different needs related to belonging, we need to be sure, again, to tailor programs and services to meet the needs of those various identity subgroups, not forgetting the impact of intersectionality. So we need to get more into tailoring.
Yeah. So the next question we have is, we've been trying to get students to participate once again on campus for student workshops, orientations. Any suggestions to get them back on campus? Well, my first suggestion is try to gather some data to find out why they don't want to come back on campus. What we're seeing on my campus is that now that students have experienced hybrid and virtual learning, they love the flexibility of that. And so thinking about, is it their interests have shifted, or their preferred modality has shifted? And can we provide some of those services, some of those orientations and workshops online or virtually that we've really in the past have just done that on campus? Erin, your thoughts?
think we need to ask the question, why do we need them to come back to campus? And that's part of thinking about sense of belonging. We need to rethink maybe what programs and services look like. If we're not getting them back to campus, what's a new approach, a new lens, to be sure that we're moving away from maybe some historically traditional approaches to new student family services orientation programs. So that would be something I would start with, the data like Gavin said, and then think about why are we doing what we're doing? Why do we want these students back on campus? And identify values and goals and approach it from that direction.
Yeah, and that's the same question we had in my doctoral programs. Is we do some things on campus and some things we didn't, and we after COVID we had the conversation about, do we really need to do an orientation, for example, on campus? There's some benefits to that, but for students who are working full time, have children coming to campus for a half day may be a little onerous, where we can accomplish the same things virtually. Or what are the pros and cons of doing those both ways? So Julie Morrison asked about, she said, those on the call represent many different types of institutions. For example, I'm at a community college. Did you or the authors identify any critical differences belonging based on institution type that we should be considering? We actually didn't focus on institution type this edition, but Erin and I talked about that because there are going to be some institutional context differences and geographic differences as well. We think about small tuition driven liberal arts institutions like mine, large research institutions, community colleges, HBCUs, HSIs, all the different minority serving institutions. Sense of belonging is going to look different at each of those institutions, but also I think the examples of applications are going to look different. And so Erin and I are already made some notes about adding the institutional context into our thoughts for a second edition. Anything you want to add, Erin?
I think you were spot on.
Okay. So Cindy asked the question, what did you learn that was surprising or new from the book? I guess the one I had a sense that identity played a role, but I didn't realize the extent to which that played a role. And some of the research that the authors pulled in that where they described research for, like, for example, African-American Black women in classes or in STEM courses, how sense of belonging looked in that way, what could hinder that, what could help that. Looking at some of the research around actually language minoritization. So students who are not primary English speakers. That was a fascinating chapter on that. We have a chapter on COVID, the impact of COVID on sense of belonging, which we hadn't really thought about before. And one chapter, which is my favorite, is on the impact of social media on sense of belonging. And when I was in college, we didn't have even computers, so that was not an issue at all. And so it'd be interesting to see what the impact that's going to be. Anything? What's surprising to you, Erin?
I think exactly what you said. Way back when I did a lot of work on Marcia and Erickson and identity status. So like you, I knew there would be a connection to social identity, but the nuance of it was surprising to me. And then I would say one of the things, and Gavin has heard me say this before, that I think is really exciting and promising is when we were doing research for the book, I found one piece of literature that talked about buildings and grounds or spaces in residence halls. And to think about how physical space on campus isn't neutral. And we know that, with staff and faculty, is to get an office on campus is often we know how territory is, but why would that not be the same for students? Green space impacts mental health. Some students said they wanted green non-smoking spaces because there's no smoking in buildings, but then people are outside. So I think that was surprising. I would like to watch some research on that and do a little bit more digging on that, because I think that's got some implications for buildings, grounds, strategic planning on campus.
Yeah. So our next question is regarding tailoring measurement and assessment strategies for different groups of students, since we mentioned tailoring programs and services for different groups. So I'll offer a couple suggestions, and then Erin, feel free to jump in. So I think the first one is taking a look at the existing tools, but more importantly, digging in a little bit deeper, not only to the psychometrics, but understanding who the samples were in those validity studies to find out, were they normed at all? What was the population? Because what we know from some other measurement studies is that they were primarily white students, or students at a primarily white institution. So just making sure that the measurement tools we're using are applicable to multiple student populations. And then my suggestion is always to disaggregate data by student identity and taking a look at that. Erin, what are your thoughts on tailoring assessment strategies and measurement?
I think that's pretty much exactly what you said. I think what we need to do is think about the disaggregation of the data, and what will help is being equity centered and equity minded around that data, and that will help get you a clearer picture of what you need to do.
Right. So Bill Heinrich had a question about, are there aware of case studies that describe the shift from college-ready students to college student-ready colleges? I think the best explanation of that is in the book that we linked to in the chat, the Student Ready College. I think the authors provide some really good description about what we typically did in college and universities and what we really need to do moving forward. Another question, any research showing post-pandemic students seem to have a lower threshold for involvement? I'm not aware of any, but it wouldn't be necessarily surprising. Erin, are you aware of any?
I was trying to think about the COVID-19 chapter, and I don't think nope, that's something we haven't touched on.
No, because that chapter is really more about the impact of COVID-19 on sense of belonging, and really about going virtual and the impact that had, and some of the isolation that resulted from those changes. So next question is, at our institution, for some students, they enroll knowing they plan to transfer to other nearby institutions, mostly for academic reasons. We'd like to stay here. We'd like them to stay here, of course. Have you encountered this in the research? Any insights? We've begun discussing ways to better onboard them, among other strategies. The only thing I can think of is, I think if you create a strong sense of belonging, they're going to be less likely to transfer, unless there's like some major or something that they want to get some prerequisites or some early courses at one institution to then go major in another. For example, we don't have engineering at my institution, but we have a pre-engineering major where students can take some of those courses and then transfer. But Erin, are you familiar with anything?
There is some out there. And I think, again, it depends on why they're planning on leaving. So like Gavin said, if it's a particular major or something like that, or, personal reasons, life reasons, I think that if you do develop that sense of belonging, that's what we see. That's what impacts retention, persistence, and graduation.
Right. And then we have another question about, are any particular residential living specific practices most beneficial to foster a sense of belonging? For example, benefits of one-on-one conversation with RAs. Erin?
Yeah, and these are really a lot. If you've ever been in Res Life, which is where I started off as a live-in hall person, there are things that we know, that work. So one thing you can't really do much about is the location of the building. But again, planning a location of the building, center of campus versus the edge of campus, that all impacts development of community relationships and belonging. I think you meant benefits of having one-on-one conversations with RAs. That goes directly to the outcome of sense of belonging. Belonging means I matter to someone. I matter on this campus. So absolutely, programming opportunities. Research shows that feeling like staff knows them well. And other things, even inclusion of community spaces. And we go back to the inclusion of academics in residence halls, academic programming, living learning. And another thing that's interesting kind of goes back to the space. personalization of rooms, movable furniture, decorating, what are your policies around room space or apartment space or whatever that looks like. So yeah, all those relationships are really important.
So one thing that made me think about was back when I was a hall director as well, the assistant director of Res Life talked about the tinkertoy theory. And what she said is, she said, hall directors are, think about tinkertoys, you're the connector. So all the residents in your building, or a lot of the residents. And for larger, I was at a smaller institution, so the residence halls weren't big, but at bigger institutions, the RAs can play this role. The RAs or the hall director knew who the folks are, and they are the ones that connect people with each other. So that's a way to increase sense of belonging, is making some of those connections. And I think the other thing that we didn't touch on is we talked about different structural things, but I think also residential curriculum and student affairs curriculum. You really thinking about focusing intentionally on those types of curricula, pull people together, gives them a common thread. And so I think it's similar to living learning communities. That can be another strategy as well. And the last question we have right now is, I think Erin touched on this a bit, but does the book contain comments or thoughts on the relationship between mental health, well-being, and belonging? We don't have a specific chapter on that, but mental health is covered in the social media chapter. So that would that comes back around.
And I would say within, I'm sorry, go ahead, Gavin.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say within each chapter, there's also, you can see some connection when you look at some of the impacts of not having a sense of belonging. But Gavin was right. We don't have one specifically touching upon it. Just some takeaways that you can probably see in the chapters.
Yeah. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Are any questions out there that people want to drop into the chat? No, I can't speak to Erin, but one thing that I learned a ton from the book. And so I think other folks may as well.
Right.
So I have a question for you.
It was fantastic.
Sorry, Erin. I have a question for either both of you or your other co-authors either. When I first heard about sense of belonging, it was maybe 2005. And I saw a dissertation that used that original scale that you talked about, Gavin. And then I had one student who conducted a dissertation, and she used it for Native American students. But why do you think that's such a hot topic now? What do you think has brought this up? It seemed like we didn't hear anything about it for a long time. And I didn't hear anything between those two studies for like 10 years. So why do you think this has popped up so much now?
I actually don't think it's a new term. I just think we're talking about it differently. I think when I was going to college, we talked about fit, finding the right fit. And I'm not sure that's the exact same thing we're talking about now, but it's still that finding the place where students feel like they fit in. And so I think it's not necessarily a new topic. I think it's become more research and more nuanced and more precise about it. But I don't necessarily think the overall concept is newer.
Yeah, I saw that question. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's always been kind of a thread going through fit, engagement, co-curricular, looking at Tinto's work. But I think we also think about how much of our students changed, how much more knowledgeable we are about student populations and social identities and intersectionality of students. That I think that's brought it to the forefront. And again, like I said, with the looming enrollment cliff and baby boom, so we've got to make some progress in this.
So we have another quick question about are there reflection questions? We didn't build that in as a standard for the chapters, but some chapters have built it in either explicitly or implicitly. But I think after reading each chapter, it'd be pretty easy to identify some reflection questions or discussion questions. And then I think we have one more, let me see. So how do you address or make sense of student sense of belonging to the institution versus a sense of belonging to the organizations, other groups, but not to the university? This is a challenge at my university, that's from Ashley. Erin, your thoughts?
So what I would say there, and that is, thank you for that question. There is going to be an overlap. If a student is feeling that sense of belonging to other groups, there's going to be a little bit of spillover. But what I would say from an institutional viewpoint to help feel a sense of belonging to the institution, think about the things that all students who have enrolled have to do. They have to register. They have to participate in academic advising. They need to meet with advisors, whatever that might be. So that's where universities can take some of their overarching functional offices and areas and help students feel like they belong, even from, if an academic advisor. The relationship with an academic advisor is the most impactful on traditionally minoritized students and rural college students. So even asking questions, an academic advisor, do you have reliable internet access? How are you finding your transition to campus? Even define university jargon. I was a first-gen college student and I had no idea what a bursar was. Yeah. So having the institution within their offices make those connections can help solidify it.
Yeah, I think that's the focus. And what do students perceive as being institutional, either programming services or, do they feel like they belong in their classroom? Does their hall director know them by first name? Do other student affairs folks know them, reach out to them to check how they're doing? I think those are some ways to build that institutional sense of belonging. But I also remember back to some early research by Alexander Aston, this whole identity of identity with the institution. And so I went to Michigan State University, huge identity. Everybody wore Michigan State stuff. And a lot of institutions are like that. But when I've been to other institutions where I don't see people wearing the logo or the name of that institution. And so that suggests to me there's probably not a lot of institutional identity there. So even thinking about, do you give all first incoming students t-shirts with the institutional name on it? So I think there's some things like that can help. Well, we're running out of time. So thanks for all your questions. Thanks for all your feedback and thoughts. I hope the session was helpful. Is there anything else that you want to add, Erin?
I think the final thing I would like to say is we know that sense of belonging has been documented as a powerful drive for success since 1943, and being involved and engaged on campus is necessary, but not sufficient for student success. And I think that would about sum it up for me.
Yep. I'm gonna pass it back to Vince to wrap us up.
Well, thank you both. This has been a wonderful session. I have loved listening to it. And I know it's the only session I've ever moderated that still had 100 people through the Q&A. So we did get up over 170 a couple of times. So thanks everybody for attending. This may be the last one we'll do of the year. We've got 3 already set up for next year. So I just want to put out a shout to Saul for allowing us to do these and have these wonderful people in these structured conversations. Thank you both for being founding members of the organization. And I hope everybody has a great week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Recording will be posted this evening.